Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I just wanted to do this quick video so you had some content, organized for you in a presentation format. It should accompany some of the things that are in the reading. This is mostly on the workers and some of the ways in which workers had issues and particular ways that workers tried to address those issues. We'll also spend a little bit of time with the Populist Party and the farmers, which I'll do in a separate video. The Standard Oil political cartoon that you can see on the screen gives us a little bit of an idea in some of the American press at the time, the way that Standard Oil was perceived by the American people. Of course, you can see the octopus, reference, Standard Oil had its hands in everything. And of course, is got its entanglement over the US government. So some of that question about the role of a corporation in a democratic society, this political cartoon kind of suggests that Standard Oil had, an outsized version of power. Standard Oil, of course, is one of the topics that came up, in the debate and Rockefeller and some of the issues and the ways in which Rockefeller went about trying to eliminate competition. That all came up in the debate, so we won't go into that. Rockefeller's product was initially really of interest because it was used for machines as an oil lubricant. There were other ways that kerosene, for example, had been used for lighting. But of course, at the time that the automobile comes about, gasoline will be used very heavily in the automobile. So of course, the product of oil becomes, ever more popular. Something to note is that Rockefeller's firm does get busted by the Sherman Antitrust Act and actually is mandated by the court to fall into 21 separate pieces. It becomes like Exxon and Mobil and all these others. And, ironically, Rockefeller actually gains a great deal of wealth as a result of that. Despite the fact that he loses the monopoly, he does not necessarily lose wealth. He actually has ownership, significant ownership in all of these, smaller entities, and ends up being fairly successful as a result. And different states then have different laws related to, how companies can pursue, and he takes advantage of some of that. In the case of some of the other things that we can look at, the percentage of billionaires in 1900, one of the things that we know about this time period that I think it was Hannah who described in the debate that this is, the Gilded Age. This is a time where everything seems shiny and new and fantastically glamorous, but of course, it's not. And one of the reasons why is this is a time of incredible wealth inequality, and we see that gap just growing and growing throughout the period of industrialization. And if you look at kind of the way in which there's, numbers of billionaires, certainly we're not seeing quantity of billionaires that's high, but in 1900 you can see the dominance of billionaires coming about in the railroads. So this idea of having these large-scale businesses that require a great deal of capital outlay but generate, these incredible returns. We see that with the railroads and then being modeled in other fields. 40% of the billionaires in 1900 are coming from the railroad industry. If we go back to 1918, sorry about that, hit the button twice. If you go back to 1918, forward to 1918, you can just see that there's many more industries that are using that model of the large capital investment for this incredible growth and returns, and new industries like food processing and the automobile industry, farm machinery, using machinery to be able to be more productive in agriculture, tobacco. So if anybody's heard of, Duke University, that was originally a tobacco company, that family, DuPont and chemicals, lots and lots of companies kind of go back to this time period, even photography, right? So like Kodak and companies like that. One of the things that we can see about trusts is that there is, with this large scale growth of industry, and there are a lot of mergers, despite the fact that Standard Oil gets actually busted up in 1911 is when that happens, and it's like an outgrowth of a few years of government oversight into Standard Oil. There is some increase in mergers in the time period. So despite the fact that Rockefeller is trust gets busted up. Lots of other companies don't, but there are efforts to regulate the trusts, and so some important things to note. Some of these are Supreme Court cases, some of these are pieces of legislation. But in 1877, there's a Supreme Court case, Munn versus Illinois. It ends up being really significant because this is a case where it is seen that the state government has the ability to regulate corporations, even to eliminate them if there is harms to the public good. So it gives states kind of a great deal of power. And, it seems like an ideal piece of legislation. By 1886, this is out the window. The holding is completely reversed in another court case, the Wabash case. And this is the case that actually gives corporations personhood. So this idea of corporations having some constitutional protection as persons, and it also declares that states cannot regulate corporations just because they may have something related to the public good. It's really only the federal government that has the capacity to regulate these large, monopoly type corporations. And the Interstate Commerce Act comes about as like the federal government's role. And, this made corporations very happy because the states had been targeting these large monopoly-like corporations, and the federal government was seen as being pretty weak at this. So having federal government only as the oversight, leads us to where we were at, with the debate topics that we looked at. By 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act is on the books, and the wording is really important. It does essentially suggest that monopolies should not be allowed, and any activity that is in the restraint of trade should not be allowed. So it's kind of described as being largely something where firms can't be anti-competitive, but there's also enforcement of this law and the way the courts tend to look at whether or not a firm is restraining trade is whether or not it's unreasonable restraint of trade. So the enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act generally considered to be fairly weak, so that's important to note. In terms of just political parties, remember the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. This is the party that's anti-slavery, the party that then becomes more pro the radical Reconstruction and then ultimately drops radical Reconstruction. This was a political party that always had business interests at heart. So think of Lincoln as somebody who was a corporate lawyer before he became president. That's what he did. But there's this sense that the Republican Party is interested in expansion out west and interested in commerce and interested in using government to be able to protect commerce. And that includes the industries maybe of banking and industries involved in large corporations. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, tends to be much more critical of corporations and tends to be more on the side of working people who are increasingly going to get louder during this Gilded Age time period. These are some other political cartoons, so some really big takeaways because we looked at the, quote unquote robber barons. In this political cartoon, you can see, the bosses of the Senate, who's really in charge of the Senate. This is the Senate of the monopolists, it says at the top. These various trusts, the Steel Trust, the Copper Trust, Standard Oil. These are individuals representing these firms, but they are, literally money bags. So we get the sense of the way in which, the rich are portrayed in some of the popular culture at the time. And of course, the government is this like very weak entity that's beholden to these capitalists. And that's a very, very kind of believed mindset, in the time period. This is another one, the protectors of our industry. And, the money bags, again, are sitting on top of money bags. And then what's holding everything up, is this group of workers, who are very defined by the products that they produce and how much they make a week. And so, this difference between the typical workers who are the masses, who are really holding up the boat, and allowing, everybody else to just basically get, a free ride. So some of this ideology is very present at the time and part of the politics of the time, very much part of the power debates at the time. So that's something to keep in mind, okay, which I think comes up in our debate. Another thing to note is the principles of Taylorism. Taylor is a person, Frederick Winslow Taylor. he creates this work, a book called the Principles of Scientific Management. This is like otherwise known as how to make workers the most efficient possible. And, we still do this today. We use a lot of data science to enhance productivity. So, if you know anyone who drives a UPS truck, the way UPS organizes its routes, there is like a, box that essentially creates the shortest way possible and also records and manages what the driver does. And there's efforts to make every single possible decision by the driver in terms of finding the next stop as fast as possible. So there's like all these efforts into collecting data and then kind of defining the routes so that way it is the most efficient possible. And of course, this doesn't necessarily keep in mind workers' needs, like when somebody, needs to take a break or, those kinds of things. And scientific management is like that. In an industrial environment, this means assembly line work. This means workers essentially being like a cog in the machine. And so scientific management is just kind of treating workers and putting workers into this machine-like environment and essentially creating a plan of efficiency between capital and labor. There are photographers who try to get this across and show society, in a sense, the problems that labor is having. So that becomes maybe a ticket to later reforms. It's just the public becoming more aware. The image on the left is kind of a famous image that showcases how the human almost appears to be part of the machine. And this is all about, Adam Smith's ideas of division of labor. And some of the other ideas of being able to not only divide labor, but be as productive as you can using technology, using capital. On the top right, you can see some of the ways in which children are going to be expected to work at this time. One of the things that happens throughout the late 1800s into the early 1900s, there's huge efforts to try to create mandatory schooling. So fewer students are able to go to work if they're mandatory in school. But in most states, and this is state by state by state, just like today where there are a lot of laws are by state, lots of states have exceptions. So parents that want to pull their kids out of school to go work in the mines, to help a parent, to work in the textile mill, often can. So we get really large numbers, especially in some communities, of children in the workforce. And that leads to a great deal of not only mental challenges and fatigue, but also injuries. And so child labor becomes a really big issue of the day. And you can see on the bottom right how gender in a lot of cases is organized, and part of the industrial workforce is often going to be segregated based on gender, based on class, of course, and a lot of new immigrants to the United States find themselves as industrial workers, and also, by race. So there's a great deal of aspects in the way people's backgrounds are also molding and shaping some of the work experiences that they might have. And then, of course, this is another image of the breaker boys. These are young boys who worked in mining in Pennsylvania. In particular, mining was in big demand, and we see a lot of boys working in that field. Some of the things that, of course, workers try to do is to unionize and to ultimately have strikes. And strikes are ways to stop working for a corporation, even temporarily, to make a point. So just like today, there might be, teacher strikes or nurses strikes, people who are trying to draw attention to labor conditions. This was very commonplace, and there are thousands of strikes in the time period of the early 1900s. Corporations also developed a great deal of tools to break strikes. So some of these include lockouts. This is something that happens in the Homestead strike. Workers are essentially locked out. They're not allowed to come to work until they accept certain conditions. Scabs, which is hiring people instead of the typical workers. If the workers are on strike, just going out and hiring other workers, in some cases recruiting workers from other communities. Yellow dog contracts are basically contracts that get signed that people agree before even taking a job that they won't join a union. Blacklisting somebody is putting their name out there so no other firm hires them. They're an agitator. And Pinkertons are these security guards that often are protecting companies and the people who are there to be replacing individuals who are striking. So